Today we're here with David Bedford, who I, as Chris Daniels, as the producer of the Fab Beatles events, as we're now calling them. David, I came across your book, which Rod Davis of the Quarrymen fame recommended to me, and he said, you're talking about all this stuff, Chris. He said, you should get this book. And I looked at it, it's an incredible sort of piece of work, really. You can see just how thick it's a real doorstop of a book, which is fabulous. And a good place to start, David, is really how did your fascination with the history of the Beatles and the Quarrymen first come about?
It all starts really from where I grew up, which was in the Dingle, literally at the bottom of the street where Ringo was born. And I attended the school that Ringo had attended for my primary school.
Yeah. So
I lived in the Dingle till I was 24. And then my wife and I, we moved out to Penny Lane, of all places. And then we had 3 daughters, all born in the same hospital as John.
Right, yeah.
And they attended Dovedale School, which is the primary school that John and George and Ivan Vaughan all attended.
Yeah.
So it was, while we were doing some stuff at the Parents Association at the girls' school, that we were looking to raise some money for the playground. And we got some national publicity because my wife and I, we organised a big school reunion. So any former pupils come along to Dovedale. And we had about 600 people turned up.
Wow.
Going back to all the decades, we got national publicity because of the John and George connection.
Yeah, sure.
So I met all kinds of amazing people who had been at the school with John and George.
Yeah.
But with the fundraising, the person who responded to our request was Yoko. And she said, how much money do you need? And we needed about 26,000. And she said, well, I'll give you 30,000. Do everything you need to. Here's some money in the pot. She's been over to the school a few times, given us some more money. I met her in Mendips, John's Aunt Mimi's house a few years ago. And I thought, this is a side to Yoko that people don't know. And so I thought, let me just write the story. I'd never written anything properly before. And I wrote for the London Beatles Fan Club magazine. I just wrote this article and thought, this was fun. Now, it coincided at a very strange crossroads in my life. I was 35 and I'd not been well. And my doctor signed me off work for a month. I went, what? That month became 3 months, became 6 months. And I was told, you're not going back to work.
Oh, right.
He eventually diagnosed fibromyalgia.
Right.
A very painful muscular condition, which meant I couldn't work. So my doctor said, what are you interested in? You've got to find something to keep your brain active. This was all happening at the same time in the summer of 2000. So I started on that first article about Yoko. And with it being in John and George's school, and I got to meet all these people who knew them, I thought, these are great stories. I'll go and buy a book about the Beatles in Liverpool. And I couldn't find one. So over the next 9 years, as my therapy, my something to do, I wrote a book called Liverpool, Birthplace of the Beatles, which is still the only major book just about the Beatles in Liverpool.
Yeah.
And it was through those connections I met Rod Davis. And I got in touch with him and said, how would you fancy the Quarrymen coming to play at Dovedale School, which was John and George's old school? And they said yes. So this was 2004. And the Quarrymen then, the original guys, was Rod, Len Gary, Colin Hanson, and Eric Griffiths. So they came down in the afternoon. Rod and Colin did this lovely history of the Quarrymen and skiffle music, did the talk. And then in the evening, I put on a concert which had a group called the Blue Meanies, who were very young. They've gone to be really, really good tribute band. A band from Birmingham called the Prellies, who did all the Hamburg stuff.
Yeah.
And then we finished with the Quarrymen. And I actually filmed it, and I was looking at the film of it yesterday. I've converted it to digital so I can give the guys a copy. And I'm putting it up on the YouTube channel. And of course, it's one of the rare appearances, because Eric is still in the group, because sadly the following year, 2005, Eric died very, very suddenly.
Yeah, yeah.
So I got to meet these guys back in 2004. So I spoke to them, did interviews while I was working on my first book. And one of the things that intrigued me was somebody had said to me, well, how did he go from being the Quarrymen to the Beatles? And I said, well, that's easy. Oh, that's not easy. And started working out, and I did this thing called the story of the Fab 27, which were all the musicians. And everybody was fascinated by this and thought, maybe I'll make that into a book.
Yeah.
Well, the way I get going on stuff, I get a little bit obsessed and go down a few rabbit holes. And the Fab 27 ended up as the book you've just shown, the Fab 104.
Yeah.
So I ended up with 104 people involved in the story from the beginning of the Quarrymen to the end of 1962 when Ringo's joined.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that struck me is just how incredibly well researched it is. And this incredible chart that you put together here.
Yeah.
Every single person that ever played with the Quarrymen and then into the first evolution of the Beatles, just almost every month or,
there's
whatever.
Changing.
Is fabulous, really. And, and so well put together, really. And just, and the images too, it's just so rich with imagery. In fact, yesterday I got a message from Paul McGann, and he says to me, was it a text? Just trying to think what it was. And he said to me, because he was hoping to come and guest and sing at but he can't. He just can't make it.
That's a shame.
It's a real shame. And he says, he's sad not to be coming to set, but he says, just read it because it's kind of like, there we go. Yeah, I'll be doing a fan convention that weekend. The lads must be getting on now. He says 80 odd. He said last year, one of them, Bill, in brackets, the original bass player, who we
Bill
know.
Smith.
Became a resident of the place my mum lives in Liverpool. It's in Woolton, 5 minutes from the church gardens, where they were playing off the back of the flatbed lorry in 56. So Paul knows his stuff too. And then he says, mum's birthday party there in April, my brother Mark, he of Lennon show fame, played and sang the old songs for 2 hours, and Bill just sat there beaming. Is that lovely? So
brilliant. Yeah, because Mark's a very talented guy. I've seen his show, absolutely superb. I mean, all the McGann brothers are so talented. All actors, all musicians, all singers. They are great.
Yeah, brilliant. And the theatre that we've got the Quarrymen event on that's coming up on the weekend. So that theatre, Redgrave Theatre, is just around the corner from where Paul lives. And he's been a patron of Slapstick Festival that I'm also involved with.
Nice.
So it was that kind of thing, but it's really nice. But it's fascinating, isn't it? So, and of course, at one point when we first put together this event, we were hoping that Chaz Newby would be joining us. Foreman, of course, and I saw him just over a year or so ago in Liverpool in conversation, and he seemed so well. So these are precious years, aren't they, that we have these wonderful people alive and we're able to set
absolutely.
their legacy. Yeah. So
I got to know Chaz because when I was doing my first book, Liverpool, he's a name I read somewhere and I couldn't really find any information on him. And as I do, I go digging, and eventually I found him and I spoke to him, and we became really good friends. Yeah. And one of the questions I did 10 questions at the front of the book, and it was, if you can answer all these questions, you don't need to buy my book.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, nobody could. And I came up with the bit of trivia which has stuck with him, which is when Stuart stayed in Hamburg, who became the Beatles' left-handed bass player? Yeah. And everybody says Paul McCartney, and it wasn't. It was Chaz Newby.
Absolutely.
Chaz played those 4 gigs at the end of 1960. We became good friends to Chaz, and just a few months back, I was asked by Rod if I'd play guitar with the Quarrymen, because Rod and I had done a couple of events in Germany last year. And then Chaz had a fall, wasn't well, and couldn't make it. And Rod said, "You don't play bass, do you?" I said, "Well, actually, yeah, I can play bass guitar as well." So I then had the honour of stepping in for Chaz
Wow.
playing bass with the Quarrymen.
Yeah.
And I think the way I introduced it was I'm stepping in for a Beatle in the Quarrymen who was stepping in for a Beatle in the Beatles.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
convoluted.
No,
he's a lovely guy, Chaz.
Yeah, and I love that. It's lovely too in terms of like your journey too, because you discover, you've got these connections to like Penny Lane and the schools, and there's this kind of narrative of you being close to the Beatles and their story, and then you become, in a sense, the historian of the early part of the Beatles, and now full circle for the event that we were talking about, like you're going to be performing with the Quarrymen, so you now are a Quarryman yourself, a Quarryman.
It's mad. It is. It's so weird, and it's such an honour. I mean, just with last year when Rod and I were doing this event, and we never really talked about the fact that I played guitar. I played washboard with them a couple of times and stuff. And he said, "I'd heard you play guitar." I said, "Yeah, that's true." Well, when we've done our tours, do you want to do a few songs together? I thought, wow. I get to play guitar with Rod Davis. So we did. And it just went down so well. And then I get this invitation to play with the Quarrymen. And it's amazing. It really is. It's gone full circle, as you say.
No, brilliant. And then for this event too, we're thinking about who would do the In Conversation. And we talked about some comedians, really. And his name. And at one point, we had it was Stuart Lee who wanted to. He's he made King Rocker, and he's very interested in his music and he's passionate about this kind of thing. Yeah. But in the end, it felt like, having seen the Rock Island Line documentary, that it was the song that changed the world or whatever that was. But yeah, just approached Billy Bragg, and he was really enthusiastic about coming and doing the chat with the lads. So that'll be quite.
That'll be superb.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then in terms of this sort of legacy of books we were chatting about earlier, there's an incredible array of books, isn't there? And the first one, correct me if I'm wrong here, because you'll know more about this. But so I've got this book. I've got a first edition of Hunter Davis's.
Oh yeah.
And in here, there are no real images of the Quarrymen. There's the one that features Len, but there's none of the early ones that we've come to know and love now. This is the only image there.
Yeah.
Quarrymen. And interestingly too, it says this is the earliest known picture of the Beatles as a group, and they were then called the Quarrymen, taken, and it says here, in 1956. So I'm fairly sure that's not 1956, is it?
Well, it can't be, because Paul and John didn't meet till 6th of July 1957.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's extraordinary, isn't it, that Hunter Davis can produce the biggest band in the world, produces and it's so sketchy that the history, just a few years later, it's all wrong.
And that's one of the biggest issues, but that's because he was relying on John, Paul and George for that part of the story.
Yeah.
And I know over the years of doing all the research, of reading all the different books, I was trying to find out the exact information. The Beatles are the worst eyewitnesses to Beatles history. They're shocking, absolutely shocking. And you can't blame them, because it was happening to them.
Yes.
But I think John gave 3 or 4 different dates for the day he met Paul, all of which were wrong.
Yeah.
So they had no idea.
It's quite nice in a way too, isn't it? Somebody was telling me they were asking, was it Mark? It might have been at the Mark Lewison events, but I think that in conversation that Paul was asked, what was the track that closed, I think with the Beatles or something, and Paul just says, I don't know. Because so fans are very knowledgeable because they're quite obsessed with the detail and this kind of thing. But if you're Paul McCartney, you that was assembled, that's gone. It's decades later. You're doing a new thing.
Exactly. That's not important.
If somebody asked me when I met my best friend, I wouldn't remember the year, let alone the date. And of course, because we care, so you get things like this book, which is it's such an important day. There's a whole book.
That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I assume you're familiar with Jim's book. So, I mean, do you have any? This is called The Day John Met Paul.
John Met Paul.
Hour by hour account.
Yeah, I mean,
how the Beatles began.
It's hard to do. I mean, the full respect, I think he's done a great job of setting the context to the day, you know, what the weather was like, etc.
Yeah.
But I know from trying to pin down what happened that day is hysterical because, and I say to the Quarrymen, I'm actually very disappointed in them. I think they should bear the blame for this because they weren't taking full verbatim notes of what was being said. They should have known at 15 or 16 this was the most important day in Beatles history, in world history, in music history, and nobody was taking notes.
Yeah,
disappointed.
Yeah,
disappointed.
Absolutely.
So everybody's got a slightly different view of what happened that day, and all you can do as a historian is examine everybody's events, everybody's phrases, quotes, whatever, put them together and think, okay, what do they all agree on? And the good thing is, because somebody then had the programme from the day, 6th of July 57, we know the date.
Yeah.
So we know it's in there. So that helps straight away. You don't rely on memories.
Yeah.
But it's like you were just saying before, you know, if you had to remember a day in history when you met your best mate, you don't remember those things. Say, oh, well, I must have been like my oldest friend we met. We would have been somewhere around 5 at school. But, you know, somewhere around 5. I couldn't have told you a month and a day.
Yeah.
So you have to think, okay, what do they agree on? Can that be corroborated? And we can get probably about 80% of the way there.
Yeah.
The rest is on assumption.
Yeah, because I've heard, you know, and I'm sure this will all come out in conversation with Billy too, in terms of Rod and Colin's memory of first meeting Paul or that day. And I know Rod saying he probably wasn't there, this kind of thing, maybe Colin too. But it's extraordinary, isn't it? It's got this mythological status, the moment that Paul, as a schoolboy, meets John.
Yeah.
Because it's such an important day. I mean, just wanted to ask you about the Quarrymen, really, and how important do you feel that period was for the Beatles? How important were the Quarrymen and Skiffle, really, to the music of what ultimately became the Beatles?
Well, Skiffle, without Skiffle, as George Harrison said, no Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles. That's it. Every major group that came through the 60s started in Skiffle. That was what got it going. Rock Island Line, that comes out at the end of 55. Suddenly it's a million seller. And everybody's thinking, we can do that. You know, that's what Paul thought when he saw Lonnie Donegan in concert a couple of weeks after his mum had died at the end of 56. He thought, I want to do that. And he got a guitar. And these groups started. And if you don't have Skiffle, you don't get the Quarrymen. If you don't get the Quarrymen, you don't get the Beatles. You know, the Beatles don't become a rock and roll group until May 1960. They start 4 years before that. You know, you've got Paul and John meeting in July 57. By the end of 1957, John, Paul and George are together. But they get plenty of ups and downs over the next few years. But if you don't have that as your basis, you don't get the Beatles. It's not as if the Beatles go, I know, let's start a rock and roll group. Ta-da, we're here. You've got that foundation. If you haven't got a foundation, you haven't got the rest of it. Without the Quarrymen starting, you don't get the Beatles.
There's no other route to the Beatles, is there, but through the Quarrymen? And because I know with perhaps, am I right in thinking the very first book that was completed around the Quarrymen was the Hunter Davis book? Was that in 2000?
Yeah, that's the first one, which was a fabulous book.
Yeah,
really good book.
Yeah, I mean, it's really accessible, isn't it? Too, and he writes he kind of segments it up into decades. So there's the pre-Quarrymen, then there's the 50s Quarrymen, and then there's what happened next
Yeah.
Which is fascinating to me, learning about Pete Shotton and his business. I had no idea he ran Fatty Arbuckle's.
Fatty Arbuckle's? Yeah.
And that he was the managing director. And that he, you know, and his Aston Martin and how successful he was financially. And but I wasn't aware of any of that, really. So it's fascinating insight to what you know, the individual members of the Quarrymen and what they did next. Really. Which is really good. And of course, this just takes it up to when they reform in the 90s.
97.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So that was a very interesting sort of start to.
Yeah, I love that book.
History, very good. I bet you used that in as part of research for your own.
Yeah, very much.
And do you know what comes next? Is that Len's book? I don't have a copy of it to hand, but what's the next Quarrymen book?
Yes, for actual Quarrymen book, there's only Len's, and most recently has been Collins. Yeah,
I've got prefab here.
The prefab, which the two Collins did with Colin Hall. So for the actual Quarrymen, they're the books that you've got as reference. Otherwise, you go to, like with my book, either Liverpool or the Fab 104, which tells like the whole story from like the historian's point of view. But from interviewing these guys over the years, getting their stories, which has been great because they're talking about, you know, the area where I live.
Yes.
But for most people, when they're writing in the book, they say, "Oh, we did this and did that." I mean, one of them, there was with Len's book, there was the CD that went with it, which is him in conversation with Pete Shotton.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really interesting. Oh. And they were talking about where Pete and John were together, and John engraved his initials into a tree near to Mendips. Now, from the description, I knew exactly where to look, and I found it.
Wow.
It's almost completely covered up now. But I discovered that, so that would have been back in about 2007-ish, 2008, something like that. And I found where John had inscribed his initials into a tree.
Yeah. Is that in the book?
That's in Liverpool. That's in my first book.
Right, yeah. I must see, I should have a copy of that here too. That's brilliant. And there are those peripheral books. So Charles Roberts, who is someone who took, am I right in saying the very first photo of the Quarrymen? Is that right?
Yeah. So Charlie's book, I edited it and got published for him.
Starting Over, is that called?
Just like Starting Over, yeah. And Charlie, again, great story, because it's not just about taking those photos on the 22nd of June 57 at Rosebery Street. And as you say, there's 3 photos that survived of the Quarrymen. They're the first ones of them. But Charlie was hanging around with the Quarrymen for a couple of years, and he's got some great stories in there. So it's more than just those photos. So that's a great book. The other one that covers a bit of that would be Michael Hill's book, John Lennon, The Boy Who Became a Legend, which again I edited and got published for Michael. Because it's a fabulous story, because Michael went through Dovedale School with John, and then through Quarry Bank School with John. And he famously introduced John to Long Tall Sally, Little Richard. And John's quote was, "The first time I heard that, it was so great I couldn't speak. That's the music that took me from Liverpool to the rest of the world." Yeah. So again, it's another eyewitness, and that's what I've been doing for over 20 years now, is finding all the eyewitnesses to the story and capturing their memories, and putting those together. And that's what I love doing, because it's the early years. If you don't have the early years, you don't get the fame of the Fab Four.
Yeah, and it is fascinating. And what's incredible is that not only are members of the Quarrymen still alive and still with us, but they're still performing, and they're still performing the music that they played and the tracks that they played back in the day. But John, I mean, it's like an immersive virtual experience of an aspect of what that might have been like. So it's really exciting, isn't it? And talking of other books, so we were talking earlier about Billy Bragg's book, which is it's not directly, it references the Quarrymen, of course, but it says a lot more really about what you've been alluding to and talking about, which is the impact of skiffle and how, if the Beatles, as Mark Lewison says, the Beatles changed music forever and for everyone, transformed music.
Yeah.
But arguably, you could say that skiffle is the thing, and that one track, even Rock Island Line, is
Yeah.
thing that also transformed music. I mean, yeah. I mean, do you have a sense? Have you've read this book, or?
Oh yeah, I love that book. I was so amazed when I read it. I'd never realised how passionate Billy Bragg was for that music, and I mean, it makes sense. You know, he's been known for all these years, singer-songwriter. Quite often, it's just him and his guitar, and you're thinking, well, he's a modern-day folk singer.
Yes.
And what skiffle really was Lonnie Donegan. He had a fascination with American folk music. And skiffle's got those roots in American folk, roots country, in some of those poor working class neighborhoods. And they're old railroad songs. And it's weird, you got this jazz musician from London who's singing these American railroad songs, which inspires lads up in Liverpool.
Mm.
And it's weird because then if you trace back country music, one of the recent books I've done called The Country of Liverpool, is you realise that the roots of the Beatles and of the Quarrymen are in country music. And the country music, which starts in the Appalachian Mountains, comes back to British folk music that travelled out there.
Yeah.
So British folk music goes to America, becomes country music, which comes over here and becomes popular, becomes skiffle, inspires the Beat generation, and then we sell the music back to America.
Yes.
It all works perfectly.
Circle. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. That's great. I love it. I love you explain that, mate. It's great. And then, yeah. So, and you have a YouTube channel, and you've been doing a series of YouTube in-depth dives, which we've been putting out actually on Fab Beatles events. I've been putting out some related directly to the Quarrymen, but you've been building that channel, which is great. Really, I don't know if you want to just let people know.
Yeah, so it's called Brightmoon Liverpool, and we are really looking at the early years of the Beatles and telling those stories with people we've interviewed over the years. We made a documentary called Looking for Lennon, all about John's formative years, which of course include the Quarrymen. And I've just started this series, which is from the very beginning. When did the Quarrymen start? Which is not an easy answer. You know, I've debated this for ages with Rod, and we've come to the same conclusion. It must have been somewhere around the May of 1956. It ties in with Rock Island Line hitting the charts. It ties in with Michael Hill playing Long Tall Sally to John somewhere around the April of 56. Because not long after that, John picks up a guitar. There's no way with that impact in early 56, John would wait till the end of 56 to start the group. And one of the people I found in the Fab 104 book was the guy who started it all, who was known as George Lee. He's the school friend of John's who said, "You like all your music, why don't you start a skiffle group?" That all must have happened somewhere around May, maybe June at the latest in 1956. That's what gets it all going. So if that doesn't start, the Quarrymen don't start, the Beatles don't happen. You've got to start back there, skiffle.
Yeah. Well, that's great, David. That's a good place to leave it for now.